I think every man on the crew had already written themselves off. I think that we just gathered that if we get out of this one, it'll be beyond a miracle. I think we were just glad to still be alive. There wasn't a thing in the world we could have done that night. I just don't think BlackJack was meant to survive the war.
New Guinea is the world's second largest island, one of the last places to be explored or colonized. It is dominated by massive mountains which rise to peaks of over 13,000 feet, forming a jagged spine along the island. Within the interior are wide, fertile valleys, inland lakes, and countless rivers. There are no railways and few roads in a rugged land where in many ways time has stood still. The aeroplane opened up New Guinea. Jackson's airport lies 7 miles north of Port Moresby Township. It handles a constant stream of traffic, from the wide-bodied jets to the smallest planes operated by the feeder airlines, which fly in and out of the hundreds of airfields all over the country. Aircraft were first brought to New Guinea in the 1920s to transport the components of the huge dredges needed for alluvial gold mining, and from this developed an air transport operation of a size and scope unique in the world. All kinds of aircraft, old and new, provide the only effective means of movement within the country. But in 1942, Port Moresby was under siege, and this airfield was called 7 Mile. Port Moresby was the last Allied outpost in New Guinea. The invading Japanese had crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains to capture it from the rear, and Moresby was under constant attack by enemy bombers. There was little warning, and by the time defending fighters got into the air, it was often too late. General Douglas MacArthur had come to Australia to command the Allied forces, and he believed that New Guinea could be held. To command his air forces, he chose General George Kenny, a brilliant, aggressive leader. It began as a desperate holding action. Every available aircraft went out in direct support of the men fighting in the jungles. Even Australian airliners were drafted to fly as unarmed transports, biscuit bombers, to drop supplies. The Japanese advance was halted, and after the recapture of Kokoda, the Australian and American forces began to take the initiative. If New Guinea was to be retaken, then Japanese attempts to reinforce their positions had to be blocked. In early March of 1943, a large convoy loaded with troops had left Rabaul and sailed for Lae, shadowed by Allied reconnaissance planes. In the morning of March 3, the ships were nearing the New Guinea coast, and every Allied plane which could fly was in the air, ready to strike. Australian Beaufighters went in first to suppress the guns on the Japanese ships. As flying fortresses passed overhead and bombed, Mitchell strafers dived to attack from mast height. The convoy was annihilated. Of 7,000 troops aboard the ships, less than 900 managed to reach the New Guinea shore. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea doomed Japanese hopes of conquest in New Guinea. New Guinea's experience had proved the value of aircraft in peacetime, and in wartime, control of the skies was critical. Kenny's airmen perfected a coordinated method of attack which had a grim rhythm and deadly efficiency. The roar of their engines filled the sky as they assembled into squadrons, groups, and wings. Inside every B-17 there were 10 men. In the cockpit area, the 2 pilots and the flight engineer. In the nose of the aircraft were the navigator and bombardier. Midships was the radio operator. Behind him the ball turret gunner and the 2 waist gunners back to back. The 10th man was the tail turret gunner. The Flying Fortress was aptly named. She bristled with machine guns and had been chosen to prove that bombers could reach any target in daylight without fighter escort. The B-17 struck deep into Germany, running the gauntlet of enemy fighters. Bombing from 5 miles high, they helped carry the war to the enemy homeland, long before an invasion could be mounted. More than 5,000 B-17s were lost in action, most of them over Europe.
Coming out of these sea whips, I saw a shape that just didn't quite fit. I kept swimming, and then this monstrous tail. I knew it was an aircraft almost immediately. It was a magnificent sight, and it'll probably be a sight I will never forget, because I sort of distinctly remember seeing wingtip to wingtip, but the sheer size of it, and I knew exactly what it was as soon as I'd seen the tail.
The plane was a Boeing Flying Fortress, more than 70 feet long and over 100 feet across the wings. Her majestic tail rose nearly 20 feet from the white coral sand. The last Flying Fortress operations in New Guinea had been flown around October 1943, so the plane had been lying there for at least 43 years. All the characteristics of a ditching were there. When the plane hit, the water would have burst in the bomb bay doors and swept back through the fuselage. The gun turret in the belly would have been torn loose and forced upward, twisting the spine of the plane and buckling the skin. The radio room hatch was open. This was where the crew would have scrambled out to escape from the sinking plane. At the empty cockpit, both windows were slid open. Pierce's passion for these old wrecks had nearly cost him his life on several occasions. Finding the B-17 was the payoff and made up for other long, fruitless searches. The waste guns were gone from the side windows, thrown overboard because they could become lethal battering rams in a water landing. It was totally intact and had aged little in more than 40 years. Time had rotted away the fabric surfaces of the rudder, and the entire plane was cocooned in a light growth of coral and sponge. The twin machine guns still jutted from the tail turret and moved freely in their mounts. Roach's presence in Niugini was the result of the recovery of this small brass plate from the cockpit of the sunken B-17. Production records showed that 124521 was accepted from Boeing's Seattle plant in July 1942. After last-minute modifications, she was flown to Australia, where she joined the 5th Air Force's 63rd Bombardment Squadron. Their war diary continued her story. The Flying Fortress was assigned to Captain Ken McCullough, a daring pilot whose exploits became a legend in the Southwest Pacific. McCullough was a flamboyant gambler, and the last two serial numbers of his new plane were 21. He named her BlackJack. McCullough's luck ran out, and he died in the fiery takeoff crash of another B-17. BlackJack was passed on to his old co-pilot, Harry Staley, and his crew. The Staley crew added their own personal touch, but the theme was the same. After Harry Staley completed his tour of duty, BlackJack was flown by nearly every pilot in the squadron. By the middle of 1943, she was a battle-scarred veteran. The war diary had shown the date she was lost and identified the pilot, Lieutenant DeLoach, and some of the crew. BlackJack had taken off a little after midnight to bomb Vuna Canal, biggest of the enemy airstrips at Rabaul. After taking off from Port Moresby, she flew a short distance to the south to circle and gain height before tackling the Owen Stanley Mountains. After the crossing, landfall was made at Kimby Bay on New Britain, and a straight course was set for Rabaul. About 30 minutes from the target, BlackJack developed serious engine problems, but the crew volunteered to keep going and complete the mission. After bombing, they headed for home across New Britain, with one engine vibrating so violently it threatened to tear itself from the wing, and the other engine on the same side giving only limited power. They flew into a fierce tropical storm and became hopelessly lost in the blinding rain. At 5:45 in the morning, they radioed that they were here. When BlackJack had not returned by 11 o'clock, other B-17s were sent to look for the missing plane. They searched the ocean and coastline over a 50-mile area, but saw nothing. After 5 hours, they returned to Port Moresby to learn that the missing crew's location had already been reported. BlackJack had been ditched between Cape Vogel and Goodenough Island. 3 of the crew had been injured when she hit the water, but all 10 escaped from the sinking plane. Most of the crew had been bracing themselves in the radio room, using parachutes and seat cushions for protection. As soon as the plane stopped, they made their way through the overhead hatch and out onto the wing of the plane. In the cockpit, Deloach was already in water up to his knees. Not wanting to risk being trapped in the bomb bay, he decided to go out through the window beside him. His flying suit was ripped from his body, but he made it. The plane stayed afloat for about 45 seconds, then sank quickly. Only one of the two life rafts had inflated, so the wounded were laid in it and the others clung to the sides. They were drifting out to sea in the current, but the villagers from Boga Boga paddled out in canoes and rescued them. Two Australian spotters had heard the crash. They radioed for help, and Flying Officer Ronald Benython had picked up the wounded men and flown them out shortly after. Another old document revealed that the two pilots had received the Silver Star for their actions that day, and that Deloach's wartime address had been St. Petersburg, Florida. Members of the family still lived there and were able to supply his current address in California. On Blackjack's last mission, she was carrying a kind of made-up crew, and it was the first time that these 10 men had all flown together. The pilots were Lieutenant Ralph Deloach and Lieutenant Joseph Moore. Moore returned to the family farm in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, after the war. The bombardier was Lieutenant Diaz of San Francisco. Navigator, Lieutenant Charles Shaver from Lee, Massachusetts. The flight engineer and top turret gunner was Sergeant Delbert Smith, the most seriously injured in the crash with a broken back. He lives in Rogers, Arkansas. The radio operator was Sergeant George Prezioso, who returned to his home in New Jersey. Sergeant Joseph Wilson from Philadelphia manned the ball turret. Corporal James Peterson of Mason City, Iowa, and Private Daniel Clinton from Brockton, Massachusetts, were at the waist guns. Clinton was flying his very first mission that night. The tail turret gunner was Sergeant Paul Blazewicz, now living in Florida.
Divers were spinning around like mad, and we couldn't get a direct bearing. But I had one at Guadalcanal, and then all of a sudden the thing spun around, and I didn't know where the hell it was then. But the electrical storm, it affects all your electrical equipment.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, you don't know. I was hearing music from Sydney, Australia, then I heard Tokyo Rose from somewhere in the islands or Japan. Oh, what the hell was coming on the radio then?
Did you actually run out of fuel, or did you...
Well, no, if you run out of fuel, then that thing would come straight down.
Oh, okay.
We had to fly that thing down into the water.
So you flew it down, and that's one of the reasons why you were able to...
get out alive. If we ran out of fuel, then not like we're going to get out. Yeah. We had to get rid of all the movable equipment, like the machine guns, you had to throw them overboard. All the transmitters, we had to throw them overboard, because if that ever jarred loose, you make a crash, those things can hit you in the head, and that'll kill you. You can forget about the jacks or the sharks.
Yeah, exactly.
Those things alone. There'd be definitely a ramrod that would strike you in the head. They all left from the radio room. We all but the pilot and co-pilot, they left from the side window, cockpit windows. Mm-hmm. It'd be in that film.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It'd be in that film. It would tell you.
Did it float for a little bit, or did it go right down?
No, we had about, they said we had 40 seconds, but I don't think we had 10 seconds. The minute we hit the water, I thought the first skip that we made, we hit at the water. Because I felt the water coming through the fuselage in Bombay. But then when I tried to stand up, then the plane really hit the water, and I went tumbling all over the place.
Oh, my.
But the bombardier, Diaz, Lieutenant Diaz, he grabbed me by the legs and he hung down to me. And Blazewicz, he was a tail gunner. He opened up the hatch over the radio room, and we all got out of that.
I understand Diaz was then killed shortly after, didn't he?
Poor guy, he got killed. They shot him down. He was into a B-24, and they shot him down on a raid, and he died out in the sea.
Oh, that's too bad.
Herman Diaz, he's from California.
Lieutenant Schaefer, he got captured. He was a prisoner of war for a while. I don't know how long, but he's gone too.
The damage to the plane made it obvious that it must have sunk nose first, hitting the seabed and then settling. The cockpit was separated from the radio room by the bomb bay. Determined to get in there, Bruce Johnson slipped off his air tank and buoyancy vest and steered them ahead of him. The bomb racks were a formidable barrier, and negotiating them was tricky. Slowly and carefully, Johnson inched forward. Outside, David Pennefather monitored his progress. Johnson emerged from the bomb bay under the top turret, just behind the pilot's armour-plated seats. Squeezing through the narrow opening, he became the first man to sit in the pilot's seat for more than 40 years. All the old instruments had disappeared beneath a veneer of coral, and the throttles and controls were locked by time.
I found this aeroplane particularly impressive. I'd never seen a B-17 before, and they're obviously such a good-looking aeroplane. There's an old adage, an aeroplane that looks good just about always flies well.
This wreck is, by far and away, the best air wreck that I've ever dived on. I would go out on a limb and say it's the best in the country, and I'll go out on a bigger limb and say you won't get a better air wreck anywhere in the world, for two reasons. A, its intactness, the actual, just how together it is, and secondly, and the magnificent war record of the aircraft. That was something we never knew when we found it, but we have since learned that this aircraft has a war record absolutely second to none, totally outstanding, flown by magnificent pilots, with war records of their own, similar to that of the aircraft itself, which makes it just totally unique. Also, it is an isolated location, very isolated, very difficult to get to, and it is at a depth whereby we can hope that it will be preserved for many, many years to come.